I study best in the morning. I study best in the morning. Reading aloud helps me remember better. Reading aloud helps me remember better. I often use flashcards for revision. I often use flashcards for revision. Group studies are really effective for me. Group studies are really effective for me. I prefer quiet libraries over busy cafes. I prefer quiet libraries over busy cafes. Taking breaks boosts my productivity. Taking breaks boosts my productivity. I always outline before writing essays. I always outline before writing essays. I find online courses very convenient. I find online courses very convenient. Regular exercise improves my concentration. Regular exercise improves my concentration. I review my notes every weekend. I review my notes every weekend. I use apps to organize my study schedule. I use apps to organize my study schedule. I enjoy studying in natural light. I enjoy studying in natural light. Music distracts me when I study. Music distracts me when I study. I use a lot of acronyms to memorize facts. I use a lot of acronyms to memorize facts. I prefer handwritten notes over digital ones. I prefer handwritten notes over digital ones. Coffee is my go-to study aid. Coffee is my go-to study aid. I always set specific goals for each study session. I always set specific goals for each study session. Discussing topics with friends clarifies my doubts. Discussing topics with friends clarifies my doubts. I like to start with the hardest subject. I like to start with the hardest subject. I find practical subjects more interesting than theoretical ones. I find practical subjects more interesting than theoretical ones. I keep my phone off to avoid distractions. I keep my phone off to avoid distractions. I review past exams to prepare for tests. I review past exams to prepare for tests. I made sure to sleep well before an exam. I made sure to sleep well before an exam. I attend every lecture to stay on track. I attend every lecture to stay on track. I find diagrams very helpful in studying. I find diagrams very helpful in studying. I like to teach others what I've learned. I like to teach others what I've learned. I always have a water bottle on my desk. I always have a water bottle on my desk. I use different colors to highlight important points. I use different colors to highlight important points. I try to connect new information with what I already know. I try to connect new information with what I already know. I prefer early morning study sessions. I prefer early morning study sessions. I find online forums helpful for solving doubts. I find online forums helpful for solving doubts. I create a checklist of topics before exams. I create a checklist of topics before exams. I make sure to have all my materials before I start. I make sure to have all my materials before I start. I use timers to manage my study time. I use timers to manage my study time. I always review my notes after class. I always review my notes after class. I find math challenging but rewarding. I find math challenging but rewarding. I use mnemonics to remember complex information. I use mnemonics to remember complex information. I enjoy studying outdoors when the weather is nice. I enjoy studying outdoors when the weather is nice. I participate in study groups to get different perspectives. I participate in study groups to get different perspectives. I update my notes regularly. I update my notes regularly. Do you prefer studying alone or with friends? Do you prefer studying alone or with friends? How often do you visit the library? How often do you visit the library? What's your favorite study snack? What's your favorite study snack? Do you use any specific apps for studying? Do you use any specific apps for studying? How do you manage stress during exams? How do you manage stress during exams? What music do you listen to while studying? What music do you listen to while studying? How long do you study each day? How long do you study each day? Have you tried using online resources? Have you tried using online resources? What subjects do you find most challenging? What subjects do you find most challenging? Do you take notes by hand or use a laptop? Do you take notes by hand or use a laptop? What's your strategy for time management? What's your strategy for time management? How do you balance study and leisure? How do you balance study and leisure? Do you have any tips for effective revision? Do you have any tips for effective revision? What's your ideal study environment? What's your ideal study environment? How do you deal with academic pressure? How do you deal with academic pressure? Do you prefer morning or night for studying? Do you prefer morning or night for studying? What's your favorite subject and why? What's your favorite subject and why? How do you prepare for presentations? How do you prepare for presentations? Do you participate in study groups? Do you participate in study groups? What techniques do you use for memorizing information? What techniques do you use for memorizing information? Have you found any useful study websites? Have you found any useful study websites? Do you have exams coming up? Do you have exams coming up? How do you stay motivated to study? How do you stay motivated to study? What's the hardest part of studying for you? What's the hardest part of studying for you? Do you review your class notes regularly? Do you review your class notes regularly? What's your favorite way to take a study break? What's your favorite way to take a study break? Do you use any specific software or tools for studying? Do you use any specific software or tools for studying? How do you organize your study materials? How do you organize your study materials? Do you follow a study schedule? Do you follow a study schedule? What's your most effective study method? What's your most effective study method? Have you tried any new study techniques recently? Have you tried any new study techniques recently? How do you handle distractions while studying? How do you handle distractions while studying? What's the best advice you've received about studying? What's the best advice you've received about studying? How do you plan your study sessions? How do you plan your study sessions? Do you prefer textbooks or online articles? Do you prefer textbooks or online articles? How do you stay focused during long study sessions? How do you stay focused during long study sessions? What challenges have you faced in your studies? What challenges have you faced in your studies? How do you prepare for a new semester? How do you prepare for a new semester? Do you use any motivational quotes or practices? Do you use any motivational quotes or practices? How do you decide what to study in each session? How do you decide what to study in each session? Do you use highlighters or sticky notes more? Do you use highlighters or sticky notes more? What's your process for writing essays? What's your process for writing essays? How do you evaluate your own progress? How do you evaluate your own progress? Do you prefer group projects or solo work? Do you prefer group projects or solo work? How do you make studying fun? How do you make studying fun? Have you learned any useful study hacks? Have you learned any useful study hacks? What do you think about open book exams? What do you think about open book exams? How do you deal with subjects you don't like? How do you deal with subjects you don't like? Do you use any online study groups or forums? Do you use any online study groups or forums? How often do you take breaks while studying? How often do you take breaks while studying? What do you do to improve your concentration? What do you do to improve your concentration? Do you use diagrams and charts often? Do you use diagrams and charts often? How do you approach a difficult topic? How do you approach a difficult topic? Do you set daily or weekly study goals? Do you set daily or weekly study goals? What's the most useful study resource you've found? What's the most useful study resource you've found? How do you recharge after a long study session? How do you recharge after a long study session? Do you prefer studying at home or somewhere else? Do you prefer studying at home or somewhere else? What's the most interesting thing you've studied? What's the most interesting thing you've studied? Do you use any special techniques for exams? Do you use any special techniques for exams? How do you keep track of all your assignments? How do you keep track of all your assignments? Do you review topics right before an exam? Do you review topics right before an exam? How do you remember complex formulas? How do you remember complex formulas? What's your strategy for multiple choice questions? What's your strategy for multiple choice questions? Do you use flashcards for language learning? Do you use flashcards for language learning? How do you tackle long reading assignments? How do you tackle long reading assignments? What's the best study tip you've ever received? What's the best study tip you've ever received? Do you prefer digital textbooks or physical ones? Do you prefer digital textbooks or physical ones? How do you summarize your notes? How do you summarize your notes? What kind of planner do you use for scheduling? What kind of planner do you use for scheduling? How do you handle group assignments? How do you handle group assignments? Do you prefer silent study spaces or a bit of noise? Do you prefer silent study spaces or a bit of noise? What's the longest you've studied in one sitting? What's the longest you've studied in one sitting? How do you keep yourself hydrated during sessions? How do you keep yourself hydrated during sessions? Do you recommend any specific study guides? Do you recommend any specific study guides? How do you keep your energy up while studying? How do you keep your energy up while studying? Do you have a favorite study chair or spot? Do you have a favorite study chair or spot? How do you deal with procrastination? How do you deal with procrastination? What's your favorite highlighter color for notes? What's your favorite highlighter color for notes? How often do you update your study methods? How often do you update your study methods? Do you use Post-its for reminders? Do you use Post-its for reminders? How detailed are your study notes? How detailed are your study notes? What's your best memory from a study session? What's your best memory from a study session? Do you drink coffee or tea while studying? Do you drink coffee or tea while studying? How do you prepare for oral exams? How do you prepare for oral exams? Do you have any study rituals? Do you have any study rituals? What's the weirdest place you've studied? What's the weirdest place you've studied? How do you handle exam anxiety? How do you handle exam anxiety? Do you prefer to study in the morning or at night? Do you prefer to study in the morning or at night? What's your favorite stationery item for studying? What's your favorite stationery item for studying? How do you stay organized with your coursework? How do you stay organized with your coursework? Do you use any educational podcasts? Do you use any educational podcasts? What's your technique for essay exams? What's your technique for essay exams? How do you celebrate after exams are over? How do you celebrate after exams are over? Do you take notes on paper or digitally? Do you take notes on paper or digitally? What's your quickest method for a study review? What's your quickest method for a study review? How do you motivate yourself on tough days? How do you motivate yourself on tough days? Do you use a study timer? Do you use a study timer? What's your favorite app for studying? What's your favorite app for studying? How do you balance work and study? How do you balance work and study? Do you study differently for different subjects? Do you study differently for different subjects? How do you make note-taking fun? How do you make note-taking fun? Do you have a go-to-study playlist? Do you have a go-to-study playlist? How do you deal with distractions from social media? How do you deal with distractions from social media? What's your favorite way to organize study materials? What's your favorite way to organize study materials? How do you handle late-night studying? How do you handle late-night studying? What's your best tip for staying focused? What's your best tip for staying focused? Do you have a study buddy? Do you have a study buddy? How do you refresh your mind during breaks? How do you refresh your mind during breaks? Do you prefer studying indoors or outdoors? Do you prefer studying indoors or outdoors? How do you manage time during exams? How do you manage time during exams? Do you color code your subjects? Do you color code your subjects? What's your favorite study-related website? What's your favorite study-related website? How do you tackle difficult chapters? How do you tackle difficult chapters? Do you use any apps to block distractions? Do you use any apps to block distractions? How do you feel about open book tests? How do you feel about open book tests?